March 11th, 1945. Canoya Air Base, Kyushu. Fluorescent lights hummed over maps pinned with red silk thread. A young intelligence officer held a stack of periscope photographs so tightly his fingertips went white. He had stared at them all afternoon, hoping the grain would resolve into something sensible, and failing every time. The camera aboard Submarine 47 had captured a silhouette that simply shouldn't exist. A hulking concrete hole with no visible guns, piping that screamed cold storage, and a parade of small workboats ferrying containers on and off like clockwork. He wrote the line that would keep him awake for the rest of the war. Concrete vessel observed, no armament, refrigeration plant evident. Classification, unknown logistics vessel. It was an insult written in steel and ice. At this very base, pilots were coaxing fuel from pine roots, an improvised program that spread 34,000 distillation units across the home islands and conscripted nearly 500,000 hands, including school children. After months of labor, the result amounted to roughly 3,000 barrels of flyable fuel, pitiful beside the daily appetite of a single American fleet. Mechanics here siphoned industrial alcohol from factory lines to stretch aviation stocks. Crews diluted fuel until engines ran hot and weak. And in the middle of the Pacific, the enemy parked a floating refrigerator the size of a small factory. A $1 million novelty that existed to turn milk into morale, 500 gallons a shift, 5 tons a day. 24 Yokosuka P-1Y-1 Francis bombers waited outside for Operation Tan No. 2. Most of the men assigned to them had barely 50 hours in the air. Their briefings were crisp and final. Take off, find Ulithi, smash into whatever you can reach, no turn for home. They wrote their death poems, tucked senbari belts beneath flight suits, and repeated the phrases that were supposed to make sacrifice feel like victory. Not one of them had been told that near Ulithi Lagoon, their target list might include a concrete barge that made dessert around the clock. The first whispers had come months earlier, after the October 1944 chaos of Leyte Gulf. When the carrier Zuikaku went down on October 25th, American destroyers hauled hundreds of Japanese sailors out of the black waves. These men braced for cruelty. They met bandages and bowls. One survivor later told interrogators he had been handed something cold and sweet in a metal cup. He'd heard the word before, but never tasted it. Ice cream, the American had called it. The sailor remembered the moment with more confusion than gratitude. On the far side of the largest sea battle in history, his enemies were feeding him a luxury unknown in his own mess. Such stories didn't travel far. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, the architect of the special attack units, understood morale like a switch you never allowed to flicker. His pilots needed the enemy to be soft. Soft could be beaten by resolve. Soft could be frightened by death. If Americans could laugh and queue for treats while shells fell, then soft didn't mean what headquarters had told them it did. But the sea kept offering evidence. In December 1944, Commander Zenji Orita brought submarine I-47 to periscope depth near Ulithi before launching manned torpedoes. He logged a sighting at 0630, a blunt-ended vessel roughly 80 meters long, poured from concrete rather than laid in steel, with refrigeration lines exposed and a bustle of small boats feeding it. He had, without knowing, located the U.S. Navy's refrigerated barge, large, an Army concrete barge reborn as a floating creamery at a cost that would nauseate any Tokyo quartermaster. 10 gallons every 7 minutes, 2,000 in cold storage at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 hours of humming machinery and clattering ladles, a non-stop river of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry that drew destroyer crews like honey draws bees. By January 1945, Japan's tanks were hollow enough to hear the rattle. The super battleship Yamato trained at anchor because a practice cruise would drink fuel that didn't exist. The Pine Root Oil Program, 34,000 distillers sweating on hillsides and behind schools, promised salvation and delivered only a puddle. Meanwhile, the 343rd Naval Air Group, the last word in elite fighter units under Captain Minoru Janda, wrestled with a quieter catastrophe, hunger. Eyes failed in twilight. Muscles twitched under high G. Reflexes dulled by missing vitamins turned duels into slaughters. My pilot's sight deserts them at night. Genda recorded in a report. Malnutrition steals more than food. The difference was cruelest where faith was demanded most. The special attack squadrons at Kenoya ate rice balls, a strip of dried fish if they were lucky, and drank ceremonial sake before boarding. Teens in cockpits, big handwriting on small letters. A last joke traded on the ramp. They tied belts sewn by 1,000 hands around their waists. The 1,000 stitches meant to weave courage and protection. Everyone knew cloth stopped neither flame nor flak. One pilot left behind a poem the base museum still displays. As cherry blossoms fall in spring, let us go bright and clean. That evening at 2007 hours, a Francis bomber found the stern of USS Randolph, CV-15, and hit. 25 sailors died. 105 were wounded. Within 3 weeks, crews had patched the carrier with 29 tons of steel, some pulled from a sugar mill on Saipan, and gone back to work. In that same span, the base facilities dispensed roughly 3,000 gallons of ice cream. Ulithi was the American idea made visible. A ring of coral that mapmakers sometimes forgot had become the largest naval hub on Earth. 722 ships gathered there by March 1945, more than Japan had ever owned at once. There were floating machine shops fitting new bones to damaged hulls, mail clerks sorting 20 tons of letters each day, theaters unspooling Hollywood reels, ball diamonds scuffed on Mogmog Island, a bakery that never slept, a distillation ship turning seawater to drinking water, and, yes, pies, and a barge that kept hammering out 5 tons of frozen consolation whenever the hands of the clock touched. If your destroyer didn't carry a churn of its own, you sent a launch with empty containers and came back heavy with promise. In the Pacific, sugar and milk were strategy. Japanese analysts stared at intercepted manifests and decided they were code. Ice cream mix had to mean ammunition. Chocolate sauce must stand in for fuel oil. Strawberry topping, surely medical supplies. No sane command would dedicate tonnage to desert during total war. Except it wasn't code. Prisoners independently reported machines aboard every ship larger than a destroyer. Recon photographs kept catching cold storage vessels moored at every forward base. And the tonnage listed under morale regularly topped the food allotments Japan issued to entire formations. The picture sharpened when Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, later notorious for sinking USS Indianapolis on July 30th, 1945, wrote about what he'd seen through a periscope months earlier. He described floating cities, where peacetime chores persisted in wartime, rows of men waiting calmly in lines, and crates exchanged between ships that were white, light, and unmistakably not fuel or shells. His executive officer echoed him, baffled. They were watching a nation fight a comfortable war. Captured pilots from the Okinawa battles repeated the same shock in different words. During Operation Kikusui, the 10-mast waves of special attacks that flung 1,465 aircraft against the American fleet between April 6th and June 22nd, survivors who failed in their suicide runs were stunned by what they found on deck. One recalled being pulled aboard a destroyer where everyone seemed to be doing exactly what they did in drills. The guns roared, officers shouted, but white uniformed cooks kept passing trays. No hysteria, no theater, just routine in the middle of the end of the world. They didn't realize it, but they were witnessing a confidence bolted to steel. Anti-aircraft belts so dense and practiced that ships could keep feeding crews under fire. By 1945, the scale of American non-essentials made their word meaningless. The Ulithi barge alone pushed out 500 gallons per shift. 3 Army barges elsewhere added another 1,500 daily. Carriers, battleships, and cruisers swapped recipes. Base plants spun all night like textile mills. Dehydrated mixed shipments in 1943 ran into 9 figures. The Army quartermaster talked in annual totals of 80 million gallons. People at home ate well. Troops at sea ate better than many civilians on the home islands. The comparison that stung most inside staff rooms. The total daily rice ration for Japanese forces still stationed in Japan by 1945 weighed less than the American appetite for ice cream in the Pacific. Even in victory, it would have been absurd. In defeat, it was a mirror no officer wanted to hold. Admiral Chester Nimitz signed off on the barge personally. He didn't speak about it in public, but in private correspondence he made the logic plain. The other side expected Americans to crack under the same conditions that cracked them. When you prove you can keep men comfortable amid horror, you change the kind of courage they bring to work. A sailor who believes his country will find a way to put a scoop in his hand. At sea will fight with a steadier heart than one who has been taught that suffering is the only true badge of service. The legend that grew out of the USS Lexington in May 1942 carried the same lesson in a funnier shape. As fuel lines burned at Coral Sea, sailors raided the freezer and filled helmets before abandoning ship. It sounded like a joke. It was an ethic. You take care of the men. You salvage the small sweetness even when smoke burns your throat. A different culture saw that and shook its head. How do you reconcile that image? A kid grinning through soot, a helmet full of melting comfort, with lectures on Bushido. How do you keep telling teenagers that pain is proof of worth when the other side proves comfort can be a weapon? The intelligence service faced an impossible job. If the truth spread, resolve would wobble. If they buried it, their own estimates of the enemy would stay wrong. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, who would later fly the last special attack on August 15, 1945, wrote in his diary that if the reports were real, Tokyo had misunderstood the war from the first day. Spirit can't outrun a machine that makes you feel at home at sea. He ordered his officers to speak none of it aloud. Secrets cling poorly to thousands of sailors. Rumors slipped through anyway. There were comic details, the kind that would have enraged an honest commissar. B-29 crews sometimes mixed powdered milk, sugar, and cocoa in ammunition cans and used the cold up at 30,000 feet to freeze a batch on their way home, turbulence doing the churning for them. At the same hour, Japanese mechanics were draining hydraulic fluid to stretch fuel or trying to fly engines that coughed on ethanol blends that cut performance by nearly a third. The contrast felt like blasphemy. Operation Kikusui proved how little theater could outweigh logistics. 10 waves in 2.5 months. 1,465 planes hurled into the teeth of radar, fighters, and steel. 4,000 Japanese pilots died in the project to erase the enemy with their own bodies. The April 6th assault, 355 aircraft in one day, managed to sink half a dozen ships and damage 22. The price was monstrous. Afterward, someone in a fleet report wrote a line that sounded like parody. Morale good. Ice cream consumption up 40%. But if you understood the system, it fit. The churns were part of the operating plan. Feed them. Fix the hull. Rest the watch. Play a reel on the fantail. Eat something that tastes like home. Repeat tomorrow. Captured officers testified in ways that made censors lean forward. A destroyer lieutenant pulled out of the water near Okinawa tried to put words to the thing that broke inside him. He expected what his own Navy meted out. Instead, a boy with an American smile handed him vanilla. Only vanilla, the kid apologized. Chocolate was out. The officer cried, and not from gratitude. He cried because he realized a nation that could afford kindness at war had stepped onto the field already 10 steps ahead. The fight wasn't just steel and fuel. It was the confidence to bring sweetness to the apocalypse. When the occupation began in August 1945, American units passed out ice cream to children who had spent years hungry. Whatever headquarters had told neighborhoods about the enemy dissolved under that first spoon. Ace Saburo Sakai tasted the stuff for the first time in 1946 on an American air base, and later wrote that he suddenly understood why they lost. The other side didn't romanticize suffering. It engineered it away. Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who led the Pearl Harbor strike, would eventually become a pacifist and tell a simple story about learning Americans had fed ice cream to prisoners. You didn't have to admire a conqueror to grasp what that habit said about the society that won. Historians would argue over the numbers and the tone, but many of them circled the same point. Some wrote that a concrete barge at Ulithi did more to announce victory than line after line of tonnage statistics. Others noted that one forced trained boys to expect a good life after the war and refused to compromise on that promise during it. The other trained boys to die well and gave them too little to fuel the training. In the 1990s, the Canoya Air Base Museum hung a small placard about American ice cream ships beside the display of a Kamikaze pilot's last meal: a small rice ball, some pickled vegetables, a cup of sake. Next to it, A photograph of that ugly concrete craft sat under glass. The curator said visitors didn't need explanations. The pairing told the whole story. Walk the numbers again, and the comparison hurts in new places. Ulithi's harbor hosted 722 American ships in March 1945. Japan at its peak had fewer than 700 in total. One barge produced 500 gallons per shift. 3 Army barges added 1,500 more. American kitchens at sea and on island bases made upward of 80 million gallons of the stuff in a year. Dehydrated mix shipments in 1943 alone measured in 9 figures. By contrast, the Pine Root Oil program that mobilized 400,000 people and littered the home islands with 34,000 distillation units yielded only about 3,000 barrels of aviation fuel from roughly 70,000 barrels of pine oil, less than the U.S. Navy burned in a single day on station. Aviation reserves dipped under 1.5 million barrels by 1945. Civilian calories fell from roughly 2,000 per day before the war to about 1,680 by the summer of 1945. Tokyoites later endured 6 months of 775-calorie rations in 1946. Pilot training time shriveled from pre-war standards of hundreds of hours to 40 or 50. Engines drank alcohol-diluted mixtures that throttled power by roughly 30%. The arithmetic of scarcity taught hard lessons late. Even small anecdotes read like parables. American sailors grumbled about flavors. Japanese sailors, when they received 315 grams of rice, said thank you to fate. American mechanics found creative ways to keep comforts running. Japanese mechanics found creative ways to keep engines turning on fluids never meant to burn. American crews at altitude babysat an ammunition can of cocoa for fun. Japanese crews prayed that a late shipment of ethanol would arrive, so students could practice landings. 2 versions of war, 2 ideas of strength. One of them had already decided what life after victory should feel like and practiced it in the middle of the fight. On March 11, 1945, none of that was obvious in a briefing room heavy with the smell of oil and hope. The intelligence officer with trembling hands didn't know he was holding a symbol. He saw only a puzzle that refused to belong to any category he'd been taught. His report filtered upward and sideways, crossed desks where men had learned to disbelieve anything that threatened the parable they needed their pilots to carry into the air. Some of those men later wrote in private that they understood, finally, what they had been up against. Not simply factories and carriers and crack units, but a culture that weaponized the absence of misery. The kamikaze who hit Randolph that evening died certain his death might break something essential in the enemy. He did not live to see the repair party lay beams, some scavenged from a sugar mill torn from another island war had chewed, and weld them into a stern that would shrug and steam again. He did not see the line at a counter on a neighboring ship, where a sailor in white scooped and passed metal cups, nodding to men with ringing ears and shaky hands. He did not see the launch from a destroyer chugging back to the berthing line with containers that sweated in the heat. If he had, he might have understood what his commanders were just beginning to suspect, that the other side's secret wasn't decadence. It was policy. Numbers settle arguments the way gravity settles a fall. The fleet at Ulithi versus the entire Japanese Navy. The output of one barge against the fuel squeezed from an archipelago of pine stumps. The hours a pilot flew before combat versus the minutes it took a churn to produce another batch. B-29 crews stirring desserts in the sky versus mechanics filling tanks with alcohol and hope. Sailors complaining that chocolate had run out versus sailors grateful for a handful of rice. Tally them in any column you choose, and the answer rhymes. The war did not end because Japan ran out of young men willing to die. It ended when the leadership realized what they were really fighting. A society so abundant that it could afford kindness at scale, so sure of its machines that it refused to let its crews live like monks in a monastery of steel, so convinced of victory that it built comfort into the operating plan and never apologized for it. The concrete barge at Ulithi, dumping frozen reassurance into every metal cup it could find, was more than a curiosity. It was a thesis about power in the 20th century. Scarcity had come to a duel with abundance and discovered that courage and hunger are not the same thing. Back at Kenoya, the officer set the photograph down and rubbed his eyes. Outside, ground crews nudged bombers down the line by hand. Pilots checked straps and instruments and folded letters into flight suits. Somewhere far out on warm black water, a workboat nodded against the side of a squat concrete hulk, and a sailor reached for a hose that breathed cold. The barge's compressors thumped a steady rhythm. The churn turned. He filled another drum and waved the launch away. On deck, men laughed at nothing, then went back to work. The night would bring attack warnings, tracer fire, and alarms. It would also bring metal cups that sweated in the dark. 2 wars, 1 sky. One side measured strength in the willingness to suffer. The other measured it in the ability to spare its people the need. March 11th fixed nothing by itself. It only focused the lens. The photographs drifting across the intelligence table showed a shape that didn't belong to any doctrine in Tokyo's books. But out in the lagoon, on a platform poured from the unromantic slurry of sand and cement, a new doctrine had been humming for months, unbothered by its own audacity. 10 gallons in 7 minutes, 2,000 in storage, around the clock. The barge proved what the bombs would later underline, that Japan had brought spirit to a fight where the decisive weapon was plenty, and plenty, it turned out, could look like a scoop in a metal cup, passed from one tired hand to another in the middle of a war.